Hello everyone. In this video lecture, I'm going to offer a few comments on the chapter that runs from page 111 to page 121, highlighting certain key passages that will allow us to further develop our understanding of this work's major themes of grief, loss, identity, memory, and history. We've already discussed the ways in which this story ultimately is about the way in which we construct history and construct our identities by developing a past. We are, in many respects, the culmination of our past. We are the results of everything that's transpired up until this point in our lives. In a way, if you can control the past, you can reshape and redefine the present. Most totalitarian dictatorships recognize that fact. On a political level, if you can shape how history is recorded or what elements of history are recorded and how those elements are reframed and presented to people, you can influence how they view present events. For Audrey, much of her descent into the past is a way for her to redefine herself, or to find a cohesive, logical, coherent, step-by-step narrative that will give her an understanding of her own life and her identity in this new world, a world that's fundamentally alien to her because her father has passed away. So when we're dealing with the experience of grief and loss, we are inevitably, in this novel, dealing with those major subjects of history and memory, how we construct identity. At the same time as she is trying to redefine herself in light of her father's death, she's also trying to do the same thing. She is in a struggle for the soul of her father, of her departed father. Who was he? Who is he going to be? Who will he be remembered as? In many ways, because of her fixation on biography, about texts in this fictional world, like Shirley MacLaine's biography, or the biography that she writes in this fiction, inside the novel, this novel and Audrey herself are very much concerned with that life story, about who tells it, how it's constructed, and how certain elements of the actual history, the events of that person's life, are highlighted or de-emphasized, or perhaps selectively edited so as to construct the narrative of that person's life, and thus to construct who that person is at the end of that life, or who you are now in the moment. All of these things dominate Audrey's experience. So as I comment on this chapter and reflect upon it, keep those ideas in mind of the interweaving of these central themes to the work. The chapter on page 111 begins with the line, "We're meeting Toff for lunch at his hotel." In this section of the text, Uncle Toby is exhausted as he gets into the car and Audrey drives him to their meeting with Toff. One of the reasons for that is that Audrey stayed up most of the evening and began to find busy work, ways of distracting herself. So for instance, she took down the fire alarm from the ceiling and began to test their batteries, just out of this sort of misplaced or displaced sense of concern for the people that she fears to lose, her uncle, primarily, as a result of that feeling of loss on the one hand, but also as an attempt to distract herself. One of the worst moments for anyone who's suffering from loss or who suffers from emotional disorders like anxiety is that moment when you go into bed and you lay there staring at the ceiling, being plagued, beset by these irrational thoughts that you can't control, that assail you over and over again, keeping you awake for hours at a time. You'll do anything to try to distract yourself to the point that you become so exhausted that you can't keep yourself awake any longer. And that's what Audrey's trying to do, trying to keep at bay those hideous thoughts of death and fear. One of the reasons that she is avoiding that bedroom, we see at the end of page 112, is, "I thought about my room with the horses on the bedspread, the bare trees on my walls, the Charlie Brown pillows. This table is my new headquarters," I said, giving it a pat. "Yes," he said, "but why?" I shrugged. "Because the rest of the house hurts." Audrey's complex relationship with the setting of the house becomes a little bit more apparent here. She doesn't want to leave that kitchen because, in a sense, she's already become acclimatized to it. If she goes back to her room and sees all those markers of childhood, of a world that's passed her by and that no longer has her father in it, a world where her father was alive and is now not, right? That childhood with the Charlie Brown bedspread and the tree that's painted on the wall. If she sees that, it hurts too much to be reminded of the reality of her father's loss, and she's entering into another room that will be forever marred by the fact that her father is no longer alive. It's painful recollections of memories that she can't control. And suddenly the reality of her father being gone, and all those memories of the times when he tucked her into bed at night or bought those Charlie Brown sheets for her, come to the forefront and agonize her and torment her. That's why she can't sleep and why she can't leave this one room. Now, Audrey goes on to reveal one of the grave errors on the part of Walter Flowers. Even though Walter Flowers doesn't know how to deal with children, it seems, he oftentimes dismisses her out of hand when he mentions, for instance, the pornography shovel. A small child is standing right there, and he speaks as if it's not going to affect her, or she can't hear her, or her lack of understanding because of her low IQ is so severe that he can say whatever he wants, and the daughter doesn't register it, or she won't ask questions about it. In many ways, Uncle Toby's relationship with Audrey, when at times he tries to conceal things from her, and at others he treats her as an adult and tries to help her to understand, as he does when he says, "Nobody was to blame for me being forced to leave." He has a far more healthy relationship with Audrey, an ability to engage with her in a way that the father can't. The deleterious and destructive impact of Walter Flowers' efforts to shield his daughter from reality come to the forefront again on page 113. Audrey says, "One thing that I love is how the fire hydrants have their own little alcoves carved out of the snow. They look so cute sitting there waiting for something bad to happen. I love how good we are at thinking ahead and preventing bad happenings. I love that about us. What else? I love the neighborhood watch sign with the yellow duct tape and the word watch and the word trust written on top of it. This seems to me to be a wonderful thing." So as she's traveling along to visit Toff or to see Toff along with her uncle, she fixates on those elements of protection and defense. The fire hydrant that's used by, well, those who protect and serve us, firefighters who risk their lives to save us, or those in need. She loves people who protect, and she loves the idea that she can be protected, that we're all invested in this communal enterprise of protecting one another. As we see in the neighborhood watch, the very purpose of it, binding together in a community, like the one that keeps a plane afloat in her imaginings in the first chapter. It's that web of goodwill that allows the magic of the plane to work. Here it's the web of goodwill, mutual support, and the desire for protection that defines her existence. And yet, we already know that Walter Flowers' efforts to protect his daughter have left her utterly bereft of an ability to grapple with, well, the reality of death and her suffering. He has infantilized her and rendered her impotent. The dangers of that overprotectiveness, of fixating on those things that protect her and keep her safe, and also of trying to distract herself from the experience of grief rather than processing it, become evident in the next line. According to the Young Driver's Manual, sometimes you'll see a wonderful thing by the side of the road, and you'll find yourself drawn towards that wonderful thing, and you will inadvertently turn the wheel in its direction. So in other words, you'll lose sight of the path. Remember the ebb, that experience of grief, is quote unquote a path that becomes less a path the more or the further along it you travel. Here we have that same metaphor of the path, driving along the road, trying to stay safe, trying to stay in the lane. But suddenly you'll be distracted. You'll be distracted from that experience of grief, the tie between the path and the road, the ebb and this drive that she's going on. You'll be distracted by those things that are trying to protect you. Or you'll be distracted by something that's more pleasant to look at, all those wonderful things on the side of your experience of grief. And what happens? You go careening off the road and have an accident. So the protectiveness of Walter Flowers, the nature of the ebb as grief and the path traveling the road as grief, are all bound up together here. The value and function of an enemy, as we noted in our last class, becomes clear on page 114. Because she has an enemy, because she's been able to construct an enemy, Toff, in her own mind, she says, "I feel tender towards everything that is not Toff." That is how you feel when you have an enemy, and it's a good feeling. So there's this cathartic release of negative energy towards him, but also the ability to better appreciate and love those with whom you have formed a community of mutual support to defend you against that enemy. Uncle Toby, on the top of page 115, likes to say that fear is the mark of insufficient curiosity. Maybe, but fear is also the mark of insufficient people to protect. We come to a slippery slope. Don't brake, palpitate. So she has to palpitate the brakes in order to prevent the car from skidding and losing control. So she is thinking now at this moment, not of protecting herself really, but she's looking over at Uncle Toby on the other side of the seat. And she doesn't have time to think about fearing for herself or thinking about protecting herself. She has now focused on him. And that's really what fear being the mark of insufficient or an insufficient number of people to protect really means. If you have other people to think about, suddenly you can't fixate on your own travails, troubles, problems, and fears. As we think about the way in which Audrey tries to construct Toff as an enemy, Look at how she frames Toff's efforts to quote unquote steal her father or steal her uncle. She's really considering them as victims who need to be protected or innocents who need to be protected by her. By thinking about them in those terms, as individuals she is responsible for protecting, she can displace her fears about herself, her anxieties, her grief, and her loss onto them. So she displaces her concerns rather than neutralizing and overcoming them, working through them in a healthy way. And we see that again when, on page 116, she says that Toff said that he would be here at 1 o'clock. It is 3 minutes to. I feel dread, which is a form of fear. So she's dreading Toff's arrival because, as we'll see, she's afraid of him taking her family away. She calls him the Lord High Executioner. Really, he's the executor of Walter's will, his brother's will. But in a way, running through that will is confirmation of her father's death. It's another, let's say, nail in the coffin for Walter Flowers. That confirmation is something that she wants to avoid. And so she constructs for herself a kind of enemy or looks for something to be curious about. That's what she's so afraid of. So she tries to distract herself from her fear to either start being curious about something, being focused on something, or fearing for someone else rather than for herself. I scanned the jungle for someone to feel curious about. No one. No one. No one. The repetition is not just no one out there, no one to see, but it's also probably a reflection of her own recognition that there's no one there, right? There's no father there. I look up at the waterfall, and she tries to distract herself. Hey, did I just see a goldfish jump into the waterfall? And she runs off to make a phone call, saying that she's going to check in on Winifred. Because she doesn't want to be caught within the trap of her own mind, and she doesn't want to fear for herself, she begins to fear for somebody else. And the only one that she can find is her tortoise Winifred. So she phones back to check up on her. When she returns, she begins to speak with her uncle. And they enter into a debate that on the surface is really just about whether Walter would have chosen to create a will. In reality, it's about who knew him best, who has the right, the ability to construct the identity of him. One of Audrey's fears is that she really doesn't know her father, that she doesn't understand who he was and who he is, or who he remembered as. On page 120, she enters into this argument with Toff, and he says, I'm here as your father's friend, an executor. Interesting, so you know when you left England my dad would need executing. Oddly, says Uncle Thoby. What are you doing? I explained all of this. Did you? I don't remember. Let's hear Toff's version. Toff reaches into the briefcase and explains that several years ago my father asked him, or rather his firm, to draw up a will, which makes me laugh. A small, all-by-myself laugh. What? He says. Come on, I nudge Uncle Thoby. My dad would never, never. Apparently he did, Audrey. So she's in this denial about the identity of her father. Her father convinced her that he actually believed that death wasn't inevitable. Here, at this moment, he's proving otherwise, that he lied to her. She doesn't want to believe that, and she doesn't want to believe that somebody knew her father better than she did, that the identity of her father that she's constructed for herself in her own mind is not untrue. So the debate that they have over whether Walter would have been the kind of person, the man, to lie and to create this will is really a debate over the identity of this person and who has the better knowledge of him. That fear that Audrey doesn't actually know her father and never did, and that he might be stolen away from her because the person that he is never really existed. He was just this construct, this person that she had imagined him to be, is registered in page 93. She hates Toff and views him as her enemy, as a threat to her family, in part because, as she says on page 93, I did not like the way Toff talked on and on about Cambridge, so where he and the father used to go to the University of Cambridge in England. I did not like this. It was ridiculous. Toff was always trying to get my dad to walk down memory lane. He needed to be interrupted more. That would be my job. The reality of memories outside of Audrey's control, the association with an identity for Walter, the experiences that he had when he was young outside of Audrey's purview, are a threat to her because she can't control that. She's trying to construct this narrative of her own life and of Walter's life to understand who he is, to define who he is. These memories that are beyond her, that she cannot share, upset and upend the kinds of narratives, the cohesive narrative that she's trying to construct. In that moment, she also registers the fear of losing her father to the past, a past that she's not a part of. She doesn't want her father to descend into these memories that she can't share, to become a person she doesn't remember. And she can't remember because they're not her memories. So Toff is framed as an enemy in this story because she's afraid that he comes to steal her father away, to make him somebody he used to be, or to remind Audrey, to tell Audrey that who she believed her father to be, the person that she thought was her father, in a way wasn't, because Walter Flowers, the actual human being, was completely different than the one that Audrey has constructed for herself in her mind. As I've stated in a previous video lecture, this novel is very much concerned with the way in which we construct history. The novel calls us to consider what kinds of emotions, needs, motivations, and inclinations drive us to shape and reshape history. Audrey is not consciously aware of what she's trying to do by going back into the past and finding comfort in it, trying to understand current events through the past, or to express current needs through the recollection and recitation of the past. But it's still the novel's thematic commentary on how we use and how we construct that history. Different tellers, like Toff and like Audrey, in the end construct different histories because of their needs and the kinds of things they remember. Toff remembers when he went to Cambridge University alongside his brother. Walter recalls that, but Audrey had no part of it. She never even knew these things. She doesn't even know how Toff is related to Walter, that they're actually brothers biologically. Memory here allows Audrey, in a sense, to keep her father alive. It's how any of us keep another person alive. That at the end of, let's say, Star Trek, the greatest Star Trek movie ever made, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, one of the characters, Spock, has died. And another one, as they're looking out at the host of heaven, the stars, says, you know, he's never truly gone as long as we keep him alive in our hearts. Now, that's an incredibly schmaltzy and saccharine line. It's overly sweet and sort of fakely sentimental. But the reality is that many of us do feel that way, that in some way we can carry on the memory of somebody who has been lost, and that they will continue to live so long as their story, their life, echoes through the corridors of history, touching our lives and shaping the way we act and live. So long as they stay alive inside of our memory, so long lives this story that we tell about them, so long do they continue to live. That's one of the reasons that Audrey tries to tell these stories. She's constantly telling the story of who her father was, trying to recall that identity and fighting back against other memories, other people's memories and other people's stories that challenge the identity that she's trying to construct for her father. No, Toff, don't go back into these memories to remind him of who he was before he had me as a child. The identity that he had there, the life that he lived. That doesn't make sense to me. That doesn't fit with the identity of my father. No, Toff, my father, the man he was and I know that he was, the man that I'm keeping alive in my memory, would never order a will because he told me that we can avoid death. He didn't believe that death was inevitable. And Toff challenges all of those things. He's a part of Walter's life that is outside of Audrey's control. By way of the fragmentary narrative that's presented to us, and Audrey's ultimately failing attempts to construct a stable, logical narrative of her father's identity, this novel is trying to tell us that people desperately desire to control the past, but it's beyond us. Audrey can't do it. She's constantly recalling things incorrectly, or reading her current concerns into past experiences. She appeals to memory as a way of keeping her father alive, but it fails every single time. Those memories are always constructed. They're always being influenced by modern needs. So the father that she remembers and the identity of the father that she constructs is flawed, incorrect. It's not an accurate representation of the man. Extrapolating outwards from the individualized case of Audrey Flowers and Walter Flowers, the novel is telling us that really all of history is like that. All of history is this amalgamation of current needs being superimposed on the events that we choose to recall. If you recall, last class we didn't have a chance to examine the final question on the symbolism of the tree. On page 90, there was a symbol of the family tree that Thoby had constructed on Audrey's wall. Symbolically, it represents everything that I've just had to say here about the way in which Audrey's understanding of her family, the artificially constructed family that she invents for herself in her mind, is dying away because of Toff's influence. In her room, she laments the fact that her tree is dying. I was in for a rude awakening, she says on page 90. The room smelled really bad because of Toff's cigarette smoke. He was smoking in Audrey's bedroom because he was sleeping there while he was visiting as Audrey was a child. There was an ashtray full and a wood brush with beard hairs on it at my dresser, and the tree painted on my wall seemed to be withering. Poor tree, I whispered and touched a leaf. Then I said it again loudly. Poor tree, I wailed. Uncle Toby poked his head in. What's going on? Notice that it's Uncle Toby who cares about her, who pokes his head in to check on see if she's all right, not her father. My tree is dying. It can't die. It's not a real tree. Yes, but it is. The tree was Uncle Toby's creation. The branches were long and bent into the adjacent walls. So the tree symbolically represents the family that's been constructed with the addition of Uncle Toby. Because, after all, we are familiar with that concept of a family tree. This family tree is artificial because you have the grafting in of Uncle Toby, who's not related to them by blood, taking the place of Toff, the actual biological member of Audrey's family tree. And the influence of Toff and the grandmother is driving Toby, that last member of the family, killing the family off from their home. So as she discusses the tree, what they're really talking about is how Uncle Toby, that member of their family that has been constructed, is being influenced and rejected by the grandmother and Toff. I unstuck a leaf from the branch and sniffed it, she continues on page 90. Smell, I said. He made a face. It's not that bad. Yes, but it is. I know, but there's nothing we can do about it right now. Come on. Why are you in here? So what they're talking about at that moment is not just the tree, but what the tree represents. And that's the way in which the family has been infected with the cigarette smoke of Uncle Toff, or of Toff. How that family is sort of wilting, withering, and dying under the influence of Toff and her grandmother. And what they're talking about at that moment is not whether it smells bad. That's literally what they're talking about. But under the surface, what they're really talking about is how Uncle Toby is being treated. He made a face. It's not that bad. Yes, but it is, she says. So Audrey experiences this tremendous swell of empathy for Uncle Toby. We're going to continue on in our analysis of the relationship between memory, loss, grief, identity, and these subjects that are sort of coalescing together in our understanding of the novel in our next interactive class. Remember to complete the quiz on these video lectures that is available in the assignments tab, and I will see you in our interactive class on Wednesday.